we are as a school right now, we have changed some medical terms. We've defined low risk and high risk exposure. The CDC has changed the policy from 72 hours if you have a fever to 24 hours without any other fever reducing medicine. That's very, very important because we still have the position that if you have a fever, we do consider it's COVID. It's not necessarily to take a COVID test and medical clearance for the students to return to school, but it's important that you understand that when you have symptoms, we assume that. And the only test that is acceptable for us when you need to get a test is a PCR, what they call a PCR COVID test. Now, I know it's a technical term. I don't really know exactly what it means, but it's the only test that's the most accurate, it's accepted as accurate for us. So individuals, this is probably the most important change that we have medically. Individuals with a high-risk exposure cannot test out of quarantine. He or she must quarantine for the full 14 days. And a high-risk exposure is considered, based on the health department and the CDC, is exposure to someone with COVID for 15 minutes less than 6 feet or less away. That's a high-risk exposure. So once that person once that person is exposed, they cannot go get a test. And the reason why that is that we have discovered and determined from the CDC rules and the health department is that people can still test positive anywhere from 2 days to 14 days. So that's important for us to know as a school that if you're exposed at home or anywhere to someone that is tested positive and you do not have a mask on, that's considered a high risk exposure. And the other thing that we have been determined by the CDC is that masks are the only approved face covering to be considered a low risk exposure. That's very, very important because as we think about where we're going, we bought net gaiters and shields and all those other things because of the aerosols in the air. And we've discovered the aerosols more and more. The CDC has discovered that the aerosols, again, can impact us too. So the shields and the gaiters may deal with a little bit of the droplets, but it doesn't take the aerosol. So at NDAA now, all the shields and stuff we purchased, the net gaiters we purchased, unfortunately now we cannot use them to maintain a low risk exposure. So understand that if your student has a fever, they have to be 24-hour fever free before they can return to campus. That's very, very important. And without the aid of medication like Motrin, Tylenol, or things like that, that's very, very important. Because fever is one of the COVID symptoms. So if the fever negates within 24 hours, that generally doesn't happen in a COVID environment. And so in those situations, now it's important to know that when you do have symptoms, you have to get a doctor to say it's something other than COVID. Because people have strep throat, we still have other diseases that we get fevers for. But because those symptoms are the same as COVID, you have to get a doctor saying, hey, my child or myself, it's not COVID, it's strep throat, it's this, it's that, it's a sinus infection or whatever, and those are acceptable to return the student back to school. So based on that information, those are the things that we're talking about as far as understanding the different exposure risks and understanding how important it is to make sure that we make sure all of the students are safe. Now, the encouraging part for you that I think you would want to know is that the majority of our exposure, the overwhelming majority of our exposure, except for the sporting events and a few PEs, are low risk exposure. So that's why when we do the contact tracing, there's some things that we're going to do differently to try to to make our contact tracing different. We're working on looking at some assigned seating and other things like that, so everyone can be in the same spot, so we can know if someone sits in the cafeteria or sits in the classroom, we know who they sat by. So then it makes our contact tracing easier, and it makes it very, very unlikely that we will ever have to close the entire school again. God forbid that we have something else. But if we maintain our policies and keep our load, it's unlikely. Nothing is absolute. I think I may have said it was absolute, but it's highly unlikely. So we want to make sure that that's the case. And we've updated the frequently asked questions to kind of cover some of the issues that you had, the questions that you may have. I didn't want to go through all of them here. I wanted to just kind of give you an update on the school. So we did start lower school on Monday. It's going well. The students are happy to be back. The teachers are happy to be back on campus. And the parents, from what I'm hearing, they're happy to have the students back on campus. So those are positives. And so those are the things we learned a few things. We're being more diligent about cleaning. The school has been deep cleaned. And all the rooms, all the classrooms, all the things were deep cleaned. And again, as part of our everyday cleaning, we sanitize and we do the electrostatic sprayer every evening. So the lockers are all done, the doors, the classrooms, we go through all of that as part of our cleaning process. So we wanted to make sure that you understood that we do everything we possibly can to minimize. And from what I'm hearing from other schools and things like that, that our policy is the most strict and we're taking the most precautions. And that's encouraging for me because I'd much rather be safe than sorry. So we're grateful on that. But the plan is for the upper school. The plan is for upper school and middle school to start on Monday. Everything will be back to normal. The 14-day quarantine period has passed. That allowed us, again, we're more prepared to handle some things. We're going to put some other things in place to kind of minimize our exposure risk. And we believe that by doing that, we can kind of shift some things around, and maybe we can isolate the people who may have the virus and continue going to school as we normally would. So that's why we use the term highly unlikely. But again, we invite your prayers. We pray every day for God to protect us, for God to keep us safe. And we believe that greater is he that is in North Dallas than he that is in the world. So we believe that so much. I want to open it up for questions now. I'm trying to see if there's any questions on that, on any other changes on the policy. If you got a chance to read the policy, I wanted to let you know that, that's, we are so ecstatic to be able to come back on Monday. We're very excited. The students I know excited. We're very excited. So are there questions on anything at all on an update of where we are at North Dallas?
Yes. Hey, Mr. Foster, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm happy that you guys were able to open up again, and I appreciate the updates that you've made to the policy, especially referring to the difference between low risk and high risk.
Yes.
I just had one question regarding the FAQs where it seems to be a bit of inconsistency. When it says in the third page that my student had a high risk exposure and has a sibling at home who is also an NDAA student, does the sibling need to quarantine? And the answer is no, the sibling may come back to school as soon as possible. In reading that, I was just a bit concerned since that sibling could be a spreader, being that they're home with a person that high exposure, and that person needs to quarantine for 14 days and may exhibit symptoms at some point within those 14 days. But this sibling was allowed to go back to school and may exhibit symptoms or may not, and then they're spreading the virus in one way or another. So that's just where I noticed that the answer for the low risk with the sibling and the high risk with the sibling, the answer was exactly the same. But if we're going to differentiate between the two, then the answer should be a bit different.
Well, I think what there's two types of exposure. There's a exposure to somebody who tests positive for COVID. So if you test positive for COVID, it's a high risk exposure. The sibling did not test. The sibling is a secondary exposure, according to the health department. It's not a primary. So that's why the sibling can return to school too, because the quarantine. Now, obviously, if the person develops symptoms, then the sibling switches to a high risk exposure. So the joy of this, and I think I've learned as much about COVID as I really want to. The joy of this is there are some things that are like, well, what about this? But the health department and CDC, the secondary exposure, because then where do you stop? Because if you have a secondary exposure, then let's say he goes somebody else's house, and then he's a third exposure, and it just keeps going and going because we don't know. So the risk remains low. The risk remains low. That's why it's very important for us as a school to keep our mask on, because even the mask is going to reduce even if you're exposed to someone with COVID. That's why when you go out to public, you don't know who has COVID or not. Mm-hmm. But when you go out in public, you keep the mask on. It minimizes the risk, and that's all we can do. So if a person has a secondary exposure, that's the difference between that primary direct with somebody that had COVID, and then now obviously the question is, if the sibling had COVID, then he's a direct exposure. But if it's a secondary exposure,
but then the sibling has already spread. I mean, and I guess that's what you're saying. Where does it stop? It would just stop within that family, right? We're not asking every other person. But for example, my daughter's in a daycare where they don't wear masks. So any exposure she has would be considered high risk. At that moment, if I ever got a phone call saying your daughter has been exposed, I would quarantine my whole family. I believe that that's my responsibility, that I'm not going to send my son to NDAA because I don't want to expose kids at NDAA to something that he may or may not already be exposed to. So that's just where I saw a bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, and I think we had a lengthy discussion on that with the so what, according even to the health department and the CDC, the secondary exposure is not considered high risk, and that's the reason why we're allowed to come back. And again, coming back to an environment where we're requiring masks, so that keeps our exposure low. Because keep in mind, if you have a mask, you have an exposure for within 6 feet for 15 minutes. All of those things have to be, so that's why it keeps it low. So very good question, thank you. Would it be safer and less risk instead of middle and upper school switching classes that teachers move classes that way there's less of students touching all the desks? That's a good question. We don't have a problem with the classes. We minimize the movement between the classes. We sanitize well enough. The students sanitize, so we don't have that problem. The teachers, some teachers cannot move classrooms because they have special things that are designed for their classrooms. So it's a little bit more of a challenge for us to do that. So we did discuss that as an option, but we kind of went to a modified block schedule so students are moving less, so that we can kind of minimize the amount of students and traffic in the hallway. And again, we're maintaining, we're sanitizing. Keep in mind, I have a full-time person that's in the hallways and sanitize all day long. So we're trying to make sure we do that. The other thing about this, and I appreciate all the parents, we're navigating an environment that every single day there's a rule change. I mean, we're discovering more and more things about the virus. And for me, I'll be honest, it's the most frustrating thing in the world for me, because I like to have a policy to be able to walk with it. But every day it's like, we bought the Gators. We remember the town hall meeting with the desk buddies and all the things and all the shields. And then now they tell me, because they told me that's what I needed to do, it was working, and then it changes. So I appreciate your patience. We are doing literally everything we can to keep children safe. Mr. Rios has a question. Question? No question?
Hi, Mr. Foster. This is Liliana. How are you today?
I'm fine. How you doing, Miss Liliana?
Good, great. We were praying for you and your daughter. I hope she's feeling better and she's well.
Thank you.
My question is, there are students coming in next week, I believe, for SAT testing. Are there any special preparations, maybe a special room, distancing for those coming in to take that test?
Yeah,
And I think I'm referring to seniors mostly.
Yes, the answer is yes and yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, we're maintaining them far away. I mean, we had a lot of practice this summer with tutoring. The tutoring went well. We were social distanced with masks. We sanitized the rooms afterwards. We plan to do the same type of thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, I thank you all so much for these few moments. I know everybody's schedule is busy. I know everybody has questions. We're doing and continue to do. We will modify. We'll continue to meet with the medical advisory team even more frequent now, because as the cases rise and CDC and the health professionals are discovering more things about the virus, there may be some changes. There may be some changes that come and will continue to change. The question about what about sports? Well, that's a day-by-day situation. We are trying our best to maintain sports. We had a lot of cancellations, like when we discovered that we had some students that tested positive. We pulled back from an event that they were literally on the bus going to. So and that happens not only to us, some of our sports people online. This happens to some of them. I appreciate our schools and administrators from other schools that we play sports with are being just as diligent. So when there's a sporting event, they will cancel an event because they believe that there's some risk. We know it's a high risk exposure. We're going to make mandatory when they're not playing, masks. There are other things that I'm reading about. They're trying to get these sports masks, but they're really expensive. Whether you can play the game of basketball with a sports mask, I'm not sure, or soccer or volleyball, but they're really expensive. I just got an email on that yesterday, and they're looking at that. We're trying to do everything we can to give some sense of normalcy to the school year, and also protect the students and the staff and the family. So that's our challenge. So right now, sports is still going, but it could change. It could change tomorrow, and we're adjusting accordingly. So I understand where we are. Any situation without a mask is high risk. If you in close contact, less than 6 feet for 15 minutes, is high risk. That's just a general rule. You can apply that in your lives. You can apply that as you go to the growth. That's the CDC, the health department. That's their definition of high risk. So what are the sports masks you're considering? Well, we're just, I just got the email on it. I will keep you up to date on it when I look at them. I haven't had time to vet them to see what they are, to see effective, to kind of take them and see. You're getting bombarded with a lot of things, and I read a lot of things about COVID and try to think of ways that people are trying to combat the illness and try to be able to live with it. So I know that there's some other schools that have talked to me about that they're looking at those masks. So we're trying to look at that as well. So I can't give you information on it because I have not vetted it. Okay, question from this. What's the plan and timing that we should get notification that if there was an exposure? We will do it as rapidly as possible, Ms. Jessica. I think we've learned a lot about how to manage this. You know, this was our first. We learned a lot about what to do and what not to do, because, and that's why earlier we were talking about modifying what we do in the classroom. We looking at ways to maybe assign seats, to do things like that, to try to identify quickly who was exposed to who. And that's the hardest part, because we have classes, then we got to check who was there, were they not there? You know, those are all of the things that go into effect. So that's why we would do. Our goal is now, by being able to tighten up a few things, we can be able to identify who's there quicker. And so hopefully the plan would be pretty much immediate. I mean, we would like to get it within 24 hours at the latest, but as quickly as we can. And so, and again, everybody, I wanted to just kind of say this. Everybody, there were some people that were notified right away, the same day. There were others that were notified later because contact tracing, people in classes, the class schedules were adjusted. We had to figure out who was in what class. Maybe they weren't there that day. So we had a lot of other things. So we wanted to make sure we covered as many people. So we've learned a few things in that process. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I thank you again. We will keep you up to date. We will continue to notify you as quickly as we possibly can. We believe that the procedures that we put in place, in fact, we know that the procedures we put in place are highly effective, because I want to remind everybody on the line that the students did not get infected at the school. And again, it's not a blame or anything like that at all. The students were clearly not negligent. There was nothing that they could do. I mean, they went to church. I mean, there was nothing that they could not. They were negligent. So we just continue to just pray that God guides us and God covers us, and that's where I am. I'm always going to put it in hand, because your students. Why I love being in North Dallas, because your students are not in Terry Foster's hands, or Anne-Marie Jacobs, or Melanie Wolf, or Becky Clark, or Rosie Arizaga's hands. They are in God's hands. Because they're in God's hands, I feel really good. And so that's what I feel good about that. I didn't see any other positive information the school will provide in a future event. As we have spoken in the previous time, it's important to protect these students. However, not providing any information usually creates a panic. And the school going to provide whether the student is in? No. Here's the reason why. It's a good question. It's the reason why we maintain. We're under FERPA rules. We maintain the privacy of the students. We don't identify the students. We try not to create we follow specific rules to not create a panic. And also to maintain, to protect the student. If it was we don't want stigmas associated, with students. We don't want any of those things associated with, hey, little Sally was in 5th grade and she's the one that closed the school down, because the kids will say that. But we will say to you, if you were a 6th grader, we will notify you that your child, and then that's the key. And we're not the only ones that do that. My stepfather's in long-term care. They do not notify us when there's a COVID case. They don't tell us who the person is. They'll just say, you were notified if your father was contracted the virus or if he was in close contact. And that's the policies that we have to do that. It's very, very important to understand that we will contact you to let you know that you were directly, your child was directly exposed to, whether it was a high risk or a low risk exposure. We will let you know that, but we will not, as a whole, as a school as a whole, we will not identify that it was a fourth grader, a fifth grader, a seventh grader, eighth grader. We will not do that. And again, like we said before, we depend on parents because at the end of the day, it's the honor system. We don't know what's in your house unless you tell us. If you have a close exposure, we don't know. I get it. See, I fully understand keeping the child's name. That's why I know that protecting the name. I guess so will you inform the parents once affected parties have been informed? Yes. Again, when I started the call, we talked about high risk and low risk exposures. The low risk exposures is where we are. We have masks, we keep masks on. If they're high risk exposure, the reason why there are people that participate in sports are high risk exposures, they cannot test out. They have to quarantine for 14 days. If we didn't have that, then we could have moved a little bit in a different direction. So the lower school, as we contact tracing, we did not have that. So we just letting you know that the best that we can do as a school is to inform you when you are truly in danger. And I know that may sound like, well, we got to depend on you. Well, we have to depend on each other. I depend on you, you depend on me. We got to do this together to keep each other safe. At what point do you decide if there's an outbreak in the school or the spread is a going concern? Once every COVID case, we have to report to the health department. And the health department has told us that if we get multiple cases, they will then take over. And that's the reason. And so the outbreak, we don't get to hide an outbreak. So trust me, if we had 5 students and all across the school, then we would have an outbreak. Then we would have to clearly shut the school down. The health department would be involved, and we will let you know. But that's not happening. And it's not our call. It's the health department's call that deems it an outbreak. That's not our call. Okay. I believe I answered all the questions. There may be others. And again, we are doing our best to keep you as informed as we possibly can. This is not an issue of trying to hide anything. We respect the rules and the privacy that we're governed by, and we will give you as much information as we are allowed by law to give you. And that's what we will always do. And know that, and we appreciate your prayers and appreciate all the time that you spend, all the people that have called and emailed and texted and all the things like that. We appreciate it. We appreciate the support, and we appreciate the prayers. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I picked on you last time, Rob. I see you here again. Would you just close us out with prayer? I appreciate it.
Let's bow our heads. Father in heaven, thank you for the opportunity to meet this evening, Lord, to just have continued updates and continued clarity. Lord, we thank you for the protection of our NDAA family, students, staff, and parents alike. And Lord, we pray for continued protection. Please honor our diligence and hold us accountable to the ever-changing information that we do the safest things for our community, Father. Bless NDAA, bless each one of these families, those that are at home and not on this Zoom, and our students as they prepare for another day of school tomorrow, and our teachers. In your name we pray. Amen.
Well, God bless. We're looking forward to seeing you guys and your students. For those who are in upper middle school on Monday, and for lower school, we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Good night.